Well, good afternoon, everyone who's joining us in person in the library, and of course, everybody who is joining us online or who will be watching this once it's taped. Welcome to Conversations with Cabrera, and it is my honor and a great pleasure to be sharing this conversation with our colleague, Professor Jackie Royster, who is very well known to Georgia Tech, having served as our dean of the Ivan Allen College for many years. And you and I got to overlap when I served on GTAB and got to enjoy your insights at the time. And we're here to talk about her latest book, Making the World a Better Place: African American Women, Advocates, Activists, and Leaders, 1773 to 1900. It's the book. If you haven't read it yet, read it. Oh, these are I could not put this thing down. And I couldn't put it down both out of interest and a little bit of embarrassment. Interest because the voices that you've collected in this volume are incredible voices, powerful voices, voices whose echoes I've heard from other authors, male authors, years later. The little bit of embarrassment is that most of these voices were new to me. I had not heard these voices before. And so thank you for bringing them back to life. And maybe I'll start by asking the why question. How did you decide to dig deep into giving a new voice to this woman?
Well, that's always the basic question. I was fortunate in a way in growing up within the arms and care of strong women all of my life. I went to Spelman and had that amplified a bit more. None of that time, though, did I meet these women in school or in a history book. And that I was not as aware of until I started working with a journal called Stage, a scholarly journal on Black women that some friends of mine and I started back in the day. And we wanted to bring these lives and contributions and stories to the public eye in a way that our mothers could understand. And that's what we did for about 15 years almost. During that time, I got my own grounding as a scholar. And I was very pleased about that because I'm in rhetorical studies. I have to say that many people believe that if you're Black in an English department, you're in literature. Well, not me. I was in language and language study, and that morphed into rhetorical studies. And I always felt that the women that I knew had a way with words, and if we would only listen to them, the world would be a better place, which is what they believed too. They just did not have always the opportunity to exercise that strength in a way that would make a difference for those around them beyond their immediate communities. So my first book, Traces of a Stream, was my saying, so where did that come from? They didn't just pop from the head of Zeus. It came from something. And so I spent time in that book trying to see how did they get to be the kind of human beings in the world that I met, that I saw, that I experienced, that ultimately I was studying. And I think that was pretty successful in bringing to light that they were actually there for the whole time, doing what they do, making the differences that they make. But the thing that I wanted to know beyond that was about the ones that actually got a chance to go to school. So when you get a chance to go to school, what do you do with all that? What kind of work do you choose to do? And what I saw was that across the board, no matter what the professional arena, no matter what the community engagement, no matter what the personal desire, they were consistently wanted to bring all of their strengths to making a better world, however they could do it, that they felt obligated to do something of value. If you're in the world, you ought to be doing something that matters to somebody beyond yourself. So this book was the follow-up to Traces of a String. Now, the quirky thing is that what I hadn't thought about all those years, and I have said more than once that I've lived more in the 19th century than I have in the 20th and the 21st, because those are the women that I studied. But what I had not studied was the Civil War. And when I came back here to Georgia Tech, guess what time it was? It was the sesquicentennial of the Civil War. It was the 100th anniversary of Gone with the Wind. It was Atlanta at its best, celebrating all of that stuff. And then I realized, because Ivan Allen used to be on Marietta Street, less than a block away from where the city of Atlanta was surrendered. There's a little marker down there that says that. I grew up in Georgia. I had paid absolutely no attention to that. None. I did not care. It was like, and then there was the war. That was fine with me. And then to rub a little salt in that realization, I came to see that the building where my office was located was a Union fort. And that the window that I looked out of was where the first bomb in Atlanta was dropped by Sherman, right where the student rec center is today. That used to be Ponder, the Ponder House. They were the first to be hit. And it's like I became aware of a person who took great pleasure in saying that I studied language and context, that I had paid no attention to the context, the specific context of war. And so my question was, well, so what were the women doing? You know, we know what the men thought they were doing, right? But what were the women doing? How were they participating? What were they thinking about? And for me, what did women of African descent, most of whom were enslaved, thought about even the possibility of this war? And that is what brought me to this.
Wow. And it's interesting because you can say, no, I'm not a historian, teach English. I am a language person. But what a powerful angle on this absolutely essential part of American history through language, right? And through the voices of these women. I'm really fascinated by it. But help us understand who these women were. And of course, I realize each of them has its own. Because what's hard to comprehend is most of them, or many of them, were born in slavery. They had very difficult access to any kind of formal education. They had to endure injustices that are just unimaginable to all of us. And with basically all odds against them, they managed to find their voice and to shape their thinking, the thinking of a whole era, right? I mean, who does that? I mean, where do you find the strength? What if you were to describe, is there any thread that all these women have in common with all the differences between them?
Well, one of the things that I wanted to underscore was that they were a diverse group. They were not all enslaved.
Right.
Some were freeborn, some were freed, some were enslaved. Some were living in the North, some were living in the South, some were living in the Middle States. And all of those geographical locations mattered because it made a difference in what you were talking about, what their access was to anything, what the conditions were within which they could exercise whatever agency they could make for themselves. In terms of finding the voice, I've had to kind of have this kind of interesting conversation with people who think that women of African descent have to find their voices. I don't think they do. I think they have them already. I think that they have a voice that is tied to a vision of who they are in the world as people who are supposed to take care of themselves, the community, and the earth. I think that's demonstrated through almost everything across the spectrum that the people that I have met do. Now, things might be changing these days, but in the beginning, that was just them. They thought that they had the right, the obligation to do stuff. And in some ways, resented people getting in their way and found a way, all kinds of ways to get around all those barriers. And to do so relentlessly. So part of it is having a vision, having a voice, having a purpose, having a focus, and then relentlessly realizing that if there is something that you need to do in the world, you find ways to do it no matter what, that you were relentless about that. And what is the pattern with all of these women is that they were relentlessly who they were. They did what they did. They found a way. They made a way when there wasn't one. And they took advantage of every single opportunity that presented itself.
Some of them were preachers, and all of them were the first ever to do, whether it was to become a physician or a preacher. Many of them went into education, which I guess was one of the areas that was perhaps a little bit more open. Some of them became education administrators.
Yeah.
So, but all of them had really the odds against them. They had to suffer lots of, amazed by how even their own economic situation, which always was tied through their marriage and then ruined, and they had to somehow find a way to feed themselves and their family while never giving up their passion to really keep that voice strong.
Well, in some ways, it's easier to stay focused when you're not turned just to yourself. So what they were doing was not just in their own interest. It was in the interest of their children, their families, their communities, their friends, the nation, the world. And so giving up would have been giving up on everything. They just didn't have that inclination, I guess. I think that the story of the minister that you were talking about is an example. This is a woman who was a staunch religious person who was dedicated to church in her community. She wanted to be a preacher, but there were no women preachers back in her day. She was sitting in church one day, and there was a pastor who was supposed to be giving a sermon. And as she says, he was faltering. And so what did she do? She stepped up to help. And when she stepped up to help, she took off. They could not deny that she was wonderful at what she had done, that she was kind at what she had done, that she was generous and courteous and supportive, and she was speaking the word of the Lord as a preacher should do. And so the head of that church, my church, by the way, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, decided that she should be allowed to participate. And of course, once you open that door just a little bit, then they find other things that they can do with themselves. And now, It's history. There's still some gender imbalance in the way that women are able to do things, but it's not as forbidden as it was when she stepped up to help out this guy who was faltering. So that's just one example.
If I read a piece from her, Jarena Lee, right?
Jarena Lee, yes.
If the man may preach because the Savior died for him, why not the woman? Seeing he died for her also. Is he not a whole Savior instead of a half one? As those who hold it wrong for a woman to preach would seem to make it appear. Did not Mary first preach the risen Savior? And is not the doctrine of the resurrection the very climax of Christianity? Hangs not all our hope on this, as argued by St. Paul? Then did not Mary, a woman, preach the gospel? For she preached the resurrection of the crucified Son of God.
Yeah. It's reasonable, rational. It just makes good sense. Why would you not have the voice and experience of a woman be a part of this world that we live in?
So the other piece that I guess, and that was maybe a little bit of my sense of, I don't know if it was embarrassment about the fact that I didn't know these women, but when the history of the Civil War is told, it tends to be told from the standpoint of man doing things, right? From agency of man, mostly white men, but even occasionally Black men. But sort of the woman is relegated to, woman's agency is relegated to second, so domestic kind of side. And what you're saying here is not at all. The agency was always there in not just making decisions, but also, again, shaping public opinion and spreading a voice about the things that were happening.
And when they chose participating in the war as well. First of all, I have to emphasize that these are 15 women exemplars that I chose deliberately. The tip of a huge iceberg, excuse me, of women that I could have chosen very easily. So they're not the only 15 to talk about. I wanted to choose some that were familiar to people and some that were not so familiar and some that people had no idea about. What I found myself doing, though, is threading the story of others through the analysis that I was doing in the book. One of the things that I wanted to make sure that people knew was that women generally, and African American women in particular, did actually fight in the Civil War. They did things in the Civil War. There are researchers who are pulling out that information. What I found more intriguing, actually, was the ones who were spies, because people expected nothing of them. They were going around collecting information as if they were invisible because people did not even see that they were there. And when they saw them, they thought that they were unworthy, as some people are saying these days, and that their presence didn't matter. Well, if you look at what these Black women spies did in the Civil War, you would know that a lot of those battles that were fought right there in that little Virginia corridor, the Union would have been much worse off if that information had not gotten to them through that spy network that was put up. If they actually dressed themselves as men occasionally and fought that way. They were, the ones who were Northern women were doctors. So they administered to the soldiers, especially the Black soldiers. Who was caring for the Black soldiers? Somebody had to take care of them. They did. They were nurses, doctors. Who was washing clothes? Who was cooking food? And the woman that I absolutely love, Miss Proctor, they had the nerve to take her farm because it was the highest hill coming into Washington, D.C. She couldn't stop them from taking her farm, but she didn't leave. She stayed and worked for the Union. But what she said was, I got my gun by my side just in case these people come up here thinking that they're going to shoot Mr. Lincoln while he's visiting. Yeah. So, it's that kind of spirit. And I think that your initial point is the point. Point of view mattered, regardless of what people think of them, regardless of what all those people around them thought of them. They thought of themselves in quite a different way. So it is informative to think about what the Civil War was through the eyes of women of African descent, whether they were free, born, freed, enslaved, whether they were in the South where things were much less open, or in the North where they were modestly more open. The other thing that people don't realize is that those categories, freeborn, freed, and enslaved, were not just Northern women. There were free people right here in Georgia, lots of them. They had to be kind of silent about it, but they were here. So, why can't we tell this history through the eyes of citizens like that? Their stories matter because they have a strength. They bring something to the table about who we are as a nation. So that's.
Yeah, the other thing that also called my attention is that when you read Frederick Douglass, and not just his famous 5th of July speech, but in some of his other pieces, where Martin Luther King Jr. century later. And then I read the excerpts that you chose for the book. It's like, oh my gosh, it was all here already.
Yeah.
The words, the themes, the narratives were here already.
Yeah.
So are we not giving these women sufficient credit for having participated in shaping those narratives that ultimately change the nation for the better, right?
I think you can answer that yourself. No, they're not getting any credit for it. But what is not really being considered deeply enough is that there was a community discourse and that there was an intellectual capacity in the community among all of the people in it. And so there was this different kind of cultural framework. I talk about that a little bit too, where women's place before the turn of the 19th century within the Black community was not like that. It was like that. Women and men were working together because conditions and circumstances were so harsh and unbelievable that they had no choice but to work together for survival, for the support of their families, to give opportunity when opportunity was available. And so if you think about that as generating, and this is my rhetorical studies hat here, a community discourse in which all people participated, where you brought your best thinking to figure out what your problems were and how you were going to deal with them, then it should not be surprising that even though it was the men up there talking as if it was just them thinking, it was not.
They were reflecting.
There was a discourse from which they had evolved. And more than that, I think the best example that I remember, I know I just fell on the floor laughing when I found this reference, was W.E.B. Du Bois and Anna Julia Cooper, because most people don't know Cooper. How many in here know Anna Julia Cooper? Yeah, that's usually about it. Maybe one, maybe two. You know Du Bois, though, I hope. Yeah, you know Du Bois. Well, guess who told him to write that book? She said to him, Dr. Du Bois, you're the one that they will listen to. You're the one who needs to put this out there. You're the one that needs to sit to put this down so that people can understand. She was an intellectual. She was president of college eventually, but she was a highly educated woman. She got a PhD from France. Couldn't get one here, you know. She was smart and worked hard and had an analytical perspective and a strategic framework for looking at the problems and conditions of African Americans. One that was shared by people like W.E.B. Du Bois. But she wrote him a little note that basically said, Dr. Bois, it's time for you to write that book. Go do it. And guess what? He did. He didn't say, Anna told me to do that, but he did. Yeah. There's a little note. There is a little copy of the note that she sent to him. Now, she might not have been the only one saying that. I don't know that. But she was there, part of the intellectual community that recognized that it was time to speak out about that.
Obviously, these women spoke to you and you chose them. I've found them, even from a 2023 vantage point, incredibly powerful. What do you hope we take from this today?
Well, I guess I could read a little bit.
Please.
That would be probably the best thing. For those of you who haven't taken a look at the book and may be intimidated, it's pretty thick, by how big it is. Oh, you know what? I can't. I don't have my glasses up here.
Sure, that can be fixed. Or if you give me the notes.
I think that I can go right here and get them. The one thing about growing older is that your body parts betray you. And my eyes are probably one of the first to go. I have.
Well, except we have technology for that.
Yeah.
In your hands.
I have had the cataract surgery and I have glasses, and now I can't see with or without the glasses. So, but I will read this little part because I think it really says more simply than I can spout off here what it is that I really intended to have happen, if I can find it. I made myself little notes because I know I have a tendency to go on and on. The very last paragraph of the book says, in being multifocal, multivocal, and multilectical. And from the point of view of rhetorical studies, that means that you take into account that there are many voices in a situation, many points of view in a situation, and many ways to express what it is that you see. So multifocal, multivocal, and multilectical. In the narratives that we write, we are more clearly positioned to render better, more inclusive stories, not simply about who the previously unacknowledged others actually are. Again, as important as that task might be, but also, just as importantly, who as a nation we actually are, have always been, and could be going forward. With a shifting of paradigms, we have a stellar opportunity as the work continues to build communities whose stories we should and can know, respect, and appreciate, and simultaneously to build a nation that lives up to its claims to being a democratic nation that believes in and is accountable to the bedrock values of truth, freedom, justice, equality, and empowerment for all. And since I finished this book, I always like to add dash all the time, not just sometimes. So I think that what I would love to see as a result of works like this, and I'm not the only one doing this kind of work, there's a lot of recovery work that's being done these days, is that we set aside our fears about difference and diversity, that we set aside our fears about what it means to be in a room when people don't exactly look like us or think like us or act like us all the time. That there are possibilities there for doing better as human beings, for telling better stories, for knowing that we get to live in peace and prosperity when we can know and understand the stories of people other than ourselves, and not be intimidated by the fact that there are such things. So I hope for that. I hope to be a part of that. I know that these women did too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. One, and maybe last question from my part. You chose these themes to structure the book: visibility, audibility, intelligibility. Tell us more about your
Why
thinking.
that?
Yeah.
Invisibility is an issue. So the question is, how do we make the people that we don't know visible to ourselves? You can walk in a room and not see, you know that there are things there, but not see who is there. So how do you teach yourself to see people? How do you make yourself listen to what they have to say? Not just talk to them, but listen to them. And in my field of rhetorical studies, we talk about what it means to listen rhetorically, to be awash in the words and ideas of others, and to develop a capacity to respond to that and to articulate your own vision. So the visibility, how do we see them? The audibility, how do we hear them? And what that meant for a book like this for me is that, publishers don't like books like these. But I had to make a case for, I cannot speak for these women. These women need to be speaking for themselves. I could not possibly capture the essence of what they were trying to do for that full run, 1773 with Phyllis Wheatley. People think that she was just this little child sitting over there mimicking the poets of her day. Well, she might have been that to a certain degree, but she was more than that. She has to speak for herself, though. And she couldn't do it in poetry. She had to do it in letters to her fellow activists. Can you imagine a little slave girl having nerve to write to George Washington? Yeah, she did that. But she also wrote to the person who was the leader of one of the Native American groups. They shared ideas in common. Okay, so listening to them, how do you listen rhetorically? And then the intelligibility is, you can see people, you can listen to them, but how do you make sense about what you see and what you hear? What is the framework within which you can interpret, analyze, and understand what it is, not just that they have done, but what they were trying to do? So that's why the book is divided into those three parts.
Terrific. Well, any closing comment?
Well, I mean, people in this room who know me is that you plug me in, I can talk the rest of the day, so we can just leave it there. Read the book.
Read the book. Well, let me put a closing plug, and I invite everybody to stay and interact with our colleague, Professor Royster. But the book is Making the World a Better Place: African American Women Advocates, Activists, and Leaders, 1773 to 1900. Absolutely, just a wonderful, wonderful read. Thank you so much,
Thank
Jackie,
you
for being
having me.
here. Much appreciated. Thank you all.